This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is from our Protecting Animals series where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member of ASA. In fact, I just renewed my membership subs just 2 days ago. It cost me $60 to join, 60 Australian dollars as someone who's waged, and it's only $15 for people who are unwaged. It was a very simple process. I did it all online. So if you also get a reminder about your subs due for ASA, I encourage you to do as I did and just pay up quickly and keep the organisation strong and working for its members. Now, this episode is also brought to you by Animal Publics. Animal Publics is part of the University of Sydney Press. Animal Publics publishes wonderful books with an animal focus. Have you been checking out their books while you've been in lockdown or in quarantine? There are lots and lots of really wonderful titles. And if you can't afford to buy Animal Publics books yourself, have a think about ordering them for your institution's libraries. That's Animal Publics at the University of Sydney Press. Okay, well, let's get down to business. This is another episode that's being recorded online with an international guest, and it's during the time of coronavirus. So we're all isolating, but it also opens up this wonderful opportunity for me to speak to people who I don't normally get the chance to speak to. Now, my guest this week is going to be very well known to probably every single person listening to the podcast. I'm really lucky to be joined by Ingrid Newkirk. Ingrid is the founder of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. She's also the organisation's president. So welcome to the podcast, Ingrid.
Oh, thanks, Siobhan. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Ingrid, can you start by telling us what inspired you to get involved in animal protection?
Oh, Siobhan, I have always cared about animals. I was born caring about animals the way some people might have a talent for art. I feel that I could read their faces and their emotions. When I was born, there was already a dog in my home, and we grew up like brother and sister. So it never occurred to me that you would do something like put an electrode in a dog's brain or carve up an animal to eat. It just seemed incongruous. But I didn't grow up in a vegan or vegetarian household. I just didn't make the connection. So over the years, I had a lot of experiences. I always say I was a slow learner. I had a fur coat when I was 19. I went fishing, and I ate with my father probably every species we could get our hands on because he was a gourmand. And he liked to try things, different kinds of food. And in fact, I don't know if they still have it, but in Sydney, at a hotel in the harbour, there used to be an elevated gourmand's area. And you sit up in a high chair and have all these wonderful meat dishes served to you. And my father, when he was in Australia, would be one of those people sitting up there. So I didn't connect the dots. And later on in life, as I saw one thing after another, including a fox and a squirrel both caught in a steel trap by some juveniles who had bought these cheap instruments, having a little fun, set them out behind a store and caught these two animals. And I thought, oh no, that's where my fur comes from. And the penny dropped. And I went on a farm and investigated a cruelty case, found a pig who had been left by the people who had just vanished, leaving him behind, leaving their unpaid bills on the floor. And this little pig who grunted with such gratitude when I held up his head and gave him a drink of water from the pump, he taught me that The pork chops I had in my refrigerator came from a slaughterhouse, and I'd never thought about it until that day. So there were many experiences in my life, including going into a laboratory for the first time and finding animals who the workers had gone home for the evening, and the one dog who was trying to give birth was having difficulty and just had a puppy stuck in her birth canal, nobody there to help her. Another dog who chewed out stitches and whose intestines were on the floor, nobody there to help him. And I thought, oh, it's not a few animals being treated humanely in life-saving medicine. It's slop. And so experience by experience by experience, my eyes opened, and I thought, well, if I, who care so much about animals, was oblivious to all these things, then other people who care must be oblivious too. And so I thought it would be good to start a group, and that is how PETA came to be. And those same sorts of things are in my new book, Animal Kind.
Yes, I've got a copy of your beautiful book here, and I've also had previous books of yours as well, Ingrid. You've been very prolific. So, Ingrid, it is quite a big decision, I think, to start your own organisation, your own animal protection organisation, and I'm sure many listeners to this episode are thinking to themselves, wouldn't it be great if I could start my own animal protection organisation? Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to start something up yourself rather than just joining an existing organisation, and perhaps a little bit about that process, what it was like in those early years of PETA?
Well, it's an excellent question, because I do think that people should support existing organizations if they believe in their philosophy. That way we become a superpower. We're not just fragmented all over the place. Although, of course, PETA supports small organizations because there are so many different things to do. But back when I founded PETA, there weren't any animal rights organization. There was the Humane Society, or SPCAs. So if your heart went out to dogs, fair enough. If you had the stomach for it, you could go down to a pound or a shelter, and you could help out. If it didn't break your heart, you could walk the dogs, you could collect towels that they needed to lie on, or papers to put in the puppy pens. You could give money if you had money. But basically, that was it. There were vegetarian societies, just a few. They were mostly for health, people who had cancer and what have you, and had gone vegetarian, not even vegan then, had gone vegetarian for those reasons. And I would go to those conferences and listen to them. And in fact, PETA was I think the first speaker, maybe the first or second speaker to attend those conferences and start to talk about the cruelty to animals in the meat and the dairy and the egg industries, even in the honey industry. But before that, at the time I started PETA, and I didn't have any huge ambitions, I just thought, I'll make some pamphlets. I know what I've seen. I'll ask people, please read this and know that if you're a kind person, you can make kind decisions when you buy things. It was very rough because there were only, I think, 3 places where you could buy a shampoo, for example, or a soap that hadn't been tested on animals. One was a cooperative where you had to take your own bottle. And one was an import from France called Nature de France. I still remember that. And I think there was one other. So there weren't vegan restaurants. There weren't really very many. There might be the very occasional Indian vegetarian restaurant. And everybody wanted a fur coat. That was the status symbol. This is 40 years ago, and things have really changed. So if you want to help, I always say, please see if you can find a like-minded organization and lend your strength to their efforts so they grow. But if you can't, more power to you. form your own group and do something that calls out to you.
Wow, yeah, indeed. So, Ingrid, as you describe it, PETA started as a rather modest organisation, just you and, some printing, some awareness flyers. Fast forward 40 years, and it really is one of the most iconic animal protection organisations in the world. Certainly, in my experience, PETA has a lot of cut through. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went from, say, a very, very small, perhaps even just yourself organisation, to really the first time you felt that you were making quite a bit of impact or waves in perhaps even just the US to start with?
Well, Siobhan, I was a cruelty law enforcement officer before I founded PETA, so I had a lot of experience with bringing prosecutions against abusers. And I took that with me to PETA, obviously, and our very first case, which I didn't have any great ambitions about, I just thought, let's go and have a look, was to see what was the closest laboratory to my apartment, and could we go and have a look inside it. I had been into big U.S. Navy labs and the National Institutes of Health lab, but this was just, what was nearest to me that PETA could look at. And we did go inside, and what we found was absolutely horrific. There were 19 macaque monkeys, and they had been taken from the Philippines, from the jungle. They were shoved in these tiny, rusted, barren cages with broken wires that stuck out, and they would get their fingers caught on them, and they would tear their fingers off. And the reason that happened is because a psychologist, not a medical doctor, not a veterinarian, but a psychologist, ran this laboratory, got a lot of money from the federal government that had no oversight over him whatsoever, just gave him the money. And he would cut the nerves in these animals, these monkeys' spines, so that they couldn't always feel their fingers, and they would get them caught on the wires and tear them off. So all of them had missing fingers. They had wounds. Some had died of gangrene poisoning. And sometimes they weren't fed because the caretaker just didn't bother to come in at night and feed them. And we documented everything that was happening, went to veterinarians, physicians, primatologists, you name it, and said, this is what we're seeing. What do you think? And we got their expert opinions, which you always need in a court of law. And we brought in the police, served a search warrant, removed the animals, and charged the psychologist with cruelty. It was the first time in the United States that somebody had been charged with cruelty to animals for conducting experiments in such a shoddy, horrible way. And that case made the news all over the world. I was on 60 Minutes Australia. It was a big case. People wanted to know, good Lord, you could actually go into a lab, you could get animals out. What's going on? And that really rocketed us, I can say that in a minute, it sent us into another dimension of being able to reach people and say, here's what you can do. And sacks of mail came into our office. And I remember the wonderful words where people said, tell me what I can do to help. And that was our joyous moment of being able to say, you can do this and you can do that and you can do the other thing. I mean, everything, you have the power of the purse. You can move the market. Don't think you're any small person. You're not. You are a consumer, and that is everything.
Mm. So that, of course, that was the Silver Spring case, wasn't it? That became so famous. So, Ingrid, I am very interested in hearing more about how PETA evolved and progressed and became, more of a international organisation. But just hearing that about the Silver Spring Monkeys case, it prompts another question that I'm very interested in, and I'd really love to hear your view. And that is, do you think in, for example, the field of animal research or perhaps animal agriculture, or perhaps both, do you think things have improved systematically, or do you think it's a case of it's harder now to know what's going on inside laboratories?
Both, absolutely both, because things have improved in many, many ways, but it's not either of those things are not small issues. I mean, the world eats billions with a B of animals every year. And of course, the torture of what happens to the cows losing their beloved calves so we can put some cheese on our pizza, and the poor egg-laying hens who are all individuals, wonderful personalities, each and every one of them. I mean, that is an extraordinary number to make an impact on. Then again, how many know? Everybody today knows what a vegan is. It's not a person from Las Vegas. And when we started, no one knew what a vegan was. So you see, I mean, Australia, I know I had one of the best vegan pizzas I've ever had in my life. It was absolutely fantastic in Sydney. And I know that lots and lots of companies, restaurants, cafes are switching to vegan food or have vegan options. You can buy this wealth of vegan food. So there's a good part and there's a bad part. The same as with laboratories. This is no small mountain to climb. I mean, animals are used by psychologists. They're used in maternal deprivation experiments. They're used in the most frivolous ways that you can imagine. Right now, we are battling a thing called the forced swim test, where pharmaceutical companies actually drop small animals into sheer-sided beakers of water. And those animals are petrified. And they swim, thinking, how can I get out of that? They dive to the bottom of the beaker, trying to find a way out. And of course, there isn't one. And eventually they give up. Pharmaceutical companies have used that test for decades, and they just write down how long it takes for the animal to be so exhausted that they give up. And it's just a meaningless test. There are so many examples of this. And so on the one hand, it's a huge battle to fight. You've got to fight this test and that test and the testing of this and that. But we've worked with the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, massive testing organization. We've been hammering them for years. We've been persuading them. We have 19 scientists on staff, every kind of discipline you can imagine. And they have shown the EPA that there are alternatives that are quicker and more effective, more relevant, that don't use animals. And finally, we just in the last 6 months had the breakthrough where the EPA announced that they are beginning the process of phasing out the use of animals to test pesticides, chemicals, and so on. We now have organs on a chip. We have whole human DNA on the internet. You know, we have so many things, high-speed computers that you can program with human data, not data from a mouse. So the technology is there finally that wasn't there before. Back in the old days, when we were starting, there was one organization for alternatives to animals, very small, and they would collect money and painstakingly work on the tiniest thing to try to get people to change. Now there is impetus. So it's huge. Everybody needs to be involved, but we're seeing great changes, but it's also a hell of a lot of work that has to be done because the problems are so big.
Yes, indeed. Now, I think the pizza you had in Sydney was probably at Gigi's, so we'll give a quick shout out to Gigi's, which is an all-vegan, fabulous Italian restaurant. So, Ingrid, bring us up to the present day. Can you tell us a little bit about PETA, the organisation? And I guess I'm interested in your size, your scope, and also, you know, your international focus, the things that you've decided to do around the world.
Well, over the years, we've founded affiliates in other countries. And one of the first, a little over 20 years ago, was in India, because I grew up in India and I saw cruelty to animals everywhere you looked, because it's not hidden away the way it is in Australia and the West and so on. It's out on the street in front of you. You can see starving dogs. You can see bullocks, oxen being beaten. You can see horses pulling enormous loads of lumber, and they're skeletal. And you can see donkeys working in the brick kilns in the heat. So I started PETA India, and then another organization called Animal Rahat, which provides veterinary services over there and tries to mechanize some of these outfits. We started PETA UK, and PETA Germany, PETA France, PETA Asia Pacific, of course, PETA Australia, all these organizations, because business has become international. So you can buy a product in any of these countries, and they all do the same thing. So, for example, you take Gillette, and you can buy Gillette razors, and you can buy, Herbal Essence shampoo all over the world. So we have to campaign together all over the world to stop any practices that hurt animals that they're conducting. The meat business, is an international business now. Live animals are being shipped. Carcasses are being shipped. So all these things, wool from Australia, of course, is making its way into marketplaces all over the world. Wool and mohair from China is making its way all over the world. So I felt that we had to have outposts in various places where we could all come together and combat these abuses. But I'm not good on how big we are. I know we have the biggest pool of all organizations of any social movement when it comes to youth. So we're quite youth focused. Those kids are going to last longer than I am, and they can do magnificent things. They can grow up in a world where they are not used to seeing some of the things like elephants standing on their heads in the circus, and animals being beaten just because we can dominate them, like the tigers with the whips and so on. So the youth program is one of my favorites. And of course, we have enormous reach. We do get stars. We do get provocative ads published. Right now with COVID-19, we're running ads saying it's time to move away from meat. And we're showing chickens in these hideously filthy slaughterhouses and factory farms, pigs lying dying, and a beautiful cow just looking up at the camera, about to lose her life. And we're asking, you don't need meat. It's not necessary. What are you thinking that you would take this individual's life for a fleeting taste?
Well, Ingrid, clearly you've done a great deal in your life, and particularly through PETA, and you've stayed the distance. The organisation is absolutely massive. When you look back on all the things that you've done via PETA, is there one thing or a couple of things that you're particularly proud of that really stand out as achievements?
Well, if you look at the victories section on our website, I think you'll be blown away, because I'm blown away when I look at it, and I'm blown away every week that we win things. There are a lot of things left to be won, that's for certain. But yes, and the only reason that we win is that we are not only persistent, but because people help us win. It's our members and supporters who answer those action alerts, who contact the corporations and their governments, and who refuse to buy things that come from cruelty and insist on buying things that come from compassion. So I owe everything to the people who have a heart and who are getting involved. Don't just leave it to some group, but a part of that group. One of the things that sticks out for me, and always will, aside from that very first conviction ever of a researcher for cruelty to animals, the Silver Spring monkeys case, and aside from the end of the head injury experiments that were conducted for football helmets and so on that we stopped, and aside from the baby monkey experiments that we stopped, where these poor infants were taken away from their loving mothers, and their mothers were doped up And then the children were frightened with rubber snakes and spiders and tried to wake up their mothers and couldn't and were petrified. We stopped those. Others are going on. But one thing that sticks out in my mind is that we stopped these car crash tests on animals. And I will never forget that, because they were carried out all over the world, that they had a device and they would put a baboon or a pig into this device, and the car company had laboratories. They would slam that animal into the wall and then just see what kind of injuries they had at what speeds. And we went to the car companies. None of them would listen to us. We singled out General Motors, which has brands all over the world. And when they wouldn't meet with us, we took our protesters to the auto shows, the car shows all over, and handcuffed ourselves to the steering wheels of cars that were on display. And police would come and cut the protesters away from the steering wheel and cart them off, but it made the press. And still the car companies didn't budge. So we then got our members to donate cars to us, General Motors cars, and we spray painted them with slogans about what General Motors was doing to animals. And we had costumed animals smash them to smithereens with a sledgehammer outside car showrooms. And still they didn't budge. And the final thing that made them budge, because they didn't know what was next, was we took donated cars and we actually set them on fire outside auto shows. And boy, was that spectacular. And so finally they thought, I don't know what these people are going to do next. And they met with us. Our scientists were able to show that there were other things to do. And today you'll see car crash dummies in ads for car safety. And that's because PETA stopped all car crash tests on animals worldwide. And that's something that will always stay with me as a victory.
Fantastic. Well, Ingrid, in addition to managing PETA and all the very bold activist and theatrical work you've done, you also are an author. And as you said, you've got a new book, Animal Kind, out. Can you say a little bit about the book and why you feel you want to write books?
Oh, yes. I mean, books are just another forum to interest people in animals, show them who animals are. And I wrote this book because it's PETA's 40th anniversary. And it's called Animal Kind, but the subtitle is really important. It's remarkable discoveries about animals and revolutionary new ways we can show them compassion. And I have to say, there has never been a time when people have been more interested in animals because of the internet. You know, we didn't have the internet when PETA was started, believe it or not. People who are in their 20s who work for us just can't believe it. They just don't know how we functioned. And looking back, I'm not sure how we did it either. But on the internet, you can see fascinating videos all the time about mother animals who are rescuing their young. There's one now about a bear with 3 cubs who got caught under a dock in a lake, and she's painstakingly retrieving them. It takes great intelligence and courage and fortitude. I have one of a raccoon whose new baby falls over a cement wall onto a roadway. And she has leaned all the way over the cement and is trying to pull the baby up, but she can't stretch all the way. And her yearling from the year before, her cub from the year before, is holding onto her legs to help her so that she can pull the baby up. I mean, there are so many wonderful things that people see, that we are no longer the kind of people of my father's generation, maybe even my generation, my grandfather's generation, who saw an elephant and thought, ooh, ivory for an ornament, or elephant's feet for an umbrella stand, or who went to the circus and laughed to see a bear riding a bicycle. that's not us anymore. There are still holdouts. There are still people who don't get it. And there's still lots of people who are so callous they don't care what happens to a human child in front of them. But there are so many people whose eyes have been opened, who've woken up to the fact that animals are individuals with thoughts and feelings. So I wrote Animal Kind in 2 parts. And the first part is fabulous stories, jaw-dropping stories about who animals are, their talents, their communication abilities, their emotions, their feats, all the things that they can do that we don't have the capability of doing often, that they're altruistic and that they go to extraordinary lengths. They have these senses that we never had. And then the second part is, now you see how wonderful, how amazing animals are. How is that going to inform your behavior? Are the things that you're doing that unthinkingly you are hurting animals by doing them? What you buy, what you eat, what you wear, how you amuse yourself, where you travel, what you say, all those things are important. You are important. You are a vital player in the revolution in the way that we think about animals, the way we react to them, the amount of respect we give them, the understanding we have of them. We need you in the army of the kind. So that's the second part of the book.
Well, that's a very, very optimistic and, affirming way to end this part of the interview, Ingrid. So I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Probably not. Who knows what they are?
We'll do it anyway. Now, you might have answered this a bit in part, but you might have another thought to share. Can you recall when you first started to think that there was something problematic or wrong about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
Oh, absolutely. It was when I read Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. And I had always thought you should be kind to animals, but it was within the context of using them sometimes. It had never occurred to me that they weren't here to be used. You should always be kind, but nobody had ever suggested, as Peter Singer did, which a light bulb came off in my dull head that said, he's right. They're like other nations. They're like other tribes. They're individuals like me. Just because they come in a different package, they look different, they might have feathers or fur or scales, doesn't mean that there isn't a person in there. And at that moment, I thought, that's what I believe. I've just never heard anybody say it, and I've been too dumb to think it myself. But now I know that we are treating them like slaves, like hamburgers on the hoof, like things, like tools for research. They're not. They're just like me.
Wow. So another one for Aussie Peter Singer, hey?
Oh, yes.
Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
Well, with the group, I can tell you, because I've always been a bit of a nag about animals. If somebody is dragging a dog down the street, I mean, I don't hesitate and never have to say, excuse me. Or if someone's wearing a fur, from the moment that I knew what was wrong with it, I'll say, excuse me, you look really nice, but do you know where that fur came from? Because that isn't so nice. But with Peter, nobody cared about chickens when we started. It was considered laughable to have any feelings about chickens. And I fostered chickens from the Humane Society. I know they're individuals. They have personalities. Some are loud, some are quiet, some flirt, some are shy. And there was a chicken slaughterhouse in Washington, D.C., which is where we started our PETA operation. And I went there in my capacity for the government. And I found them slitting the chickens' throats and turning the chickens alive upside down into these metal cones and letting them bleed to death. And I thought, this cannot be allowed. So PETA picketed the chicken slaughterhouse. And people thought that was so odd that it was on the news. It was on every radio station, every television station, on the front page of the Washington Post. You couldn't go anywhere without people talking about this. And I thought, this is great, because finally someone is going to discuss whether chickens have feelings. Even if they mostly dismiss it, the subject is now on the table.
Wonderful. I agree. It's such a shame that we still have the battery cage all these years later.
I know.
So, if you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, it has to be Peter Singer, because of the fact he wrote that book. I mean, I've written a book, but I could never equal what Peter Singer did with animal liberation, because from a philosopher's podium, he was able to say to people, let me argue this out for you. Just as, it was said that it doesn't matter how many legs a living being has, or what they look like, or the color of their skin, or whether they come from the same country, or they hold the same religious views, or you like them or you dislike them. You should not be a bully. You shouldn't impose suffering. There's a principle here that might doesn't make right. And he made that argument so beautifully, so forcefully, that yes, buy my book, Animal Kind, but really buy Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, too.
Absolutely. So, Ingrid, what's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
Get busy. Please, please, please. You have one life to live. And if you're young, you may think it's going to stretch out before you endless years. Time speeds up. And I know every person who is getting on in years say this, but it does. And I now think, what if you were wearing a watch that told you how long you had to live, not the time of day, but how many years or weeks or months, hours you had left? You do not want to be on your deathbed looking back and saying to yourself, gosh, I didn't do very much. I know that's wrong, but I never said anything about it. I never tried to educate somebody else to get them to see that they could be kind. And so I say to people, please seize every opportunity. We're in lockdown, but you're allowed to go shopping. I take the magazine, the Vegan Starter Kit, and I take it to the grocery store and I put it in the magazine racks. I mean, I don't care if someone wants to buy Women's Day or, whatever it is. I want them to see the Vegan Starter Kit right in front of them at the checkout stand. And everywhere I go, I have literature. If there's any chance of talking to someone, giving them food, giving them an idea, using social media, do it, do it, do it. Do the Nike slogan, just do it, or we're not going to win this thing. And how many things you do and how quickly you do them will make all the difference to animals in the world, and they depend on us all.
Wonderful. Well, Ingrid, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
That is such a tough question. Well, I mean, just basically, I would turn it from disrespect to respect, from not caring to caring, from not understanding to understanding. And if it's a practical thing, perhaps if you could just choose one thing, it would be, for me, not treating some animals as pests or inconveniences, because they shouldn't be viewed as how they relate to us in our lives. It's not whether we're inconvenienced or we find them a pest. People use harsh poisons on so many little animals, and so many big ones too. I was on a sheep farm in Australia, and they used compound 1080, and to keep out the predators for the sheep. But they were the biggest predators of the sheep of all. And they were mulesing on that farm, and they were shearing and cutting the sheep to shreds. And then the sheep would go on the ships and to live export. So I think, those animals were considered, it doesn't matter if you poison them to death. And I think there are so many animals who fall into that category That if you could stop one thing, for me it might be that. Of course, chickens come a close second.
Wonderful. Well, Ingrid, I know this isn't going to be an easy question to answer either, but what are you working on next? Is there a particular project coming up?
We're working on a million things. It's never easy to say which one, but we've always been true to our founding principles, which are animals are not ours to experiment on, eat, wear, use to entertain us, or abuse in any way. So in each one of those categories, where vast numbers of animals are suffering horrifically and often being killed, we have projects in the works. If you look at PETA.org, you look at our magazine, you will find all sorts of action alerts asking you to get in touch with corporations who are sponsoring things they shouldn't sponsor, who are selling things they shouldn't sell, and who need to change their ways. So I think it's hard to pinpoint one, but at the moment, my project for the foreseeable future, among others, is to get Animal Kind, the book, into schools, into libraries, into the hands of people who have maybe a dog at home, but haven't thought beyond that, but do have a good heart.
So how can people find the book or buy the book? I guess at the PETA website and also online booksellers, would that be it?
Yes, Amazon.com, anywhere where you would buy books online. And some of them are in the bookstores that are now closed, so that's not very helpful, is it?
Well, I've got a copy in front of me. It looks absolutely wonderful. Ingrid, thank you so much for joining me and for joining the listeners on Knowing Animals.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Siobhan, and good luck to everybody in their activism. Go for it.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about the work they do for animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.